Sophie Reynolds had always felt like an outsider in her own family. Her grandfather, Charles, was tough as nails, a man who lived and breathed ranching. Her mother, Rachel, had a softer side but was often lost in the stress of keeping the ranch afloat. And then there was Sophie, a 12-year-old girl with a heart too big for the world around her, a girl who could feel the pulse of the land and the animals like no one else. It wasn't that Sophie didn't love the ranch. She did. It was just that the horses, the wind in the trees, and the wide, open spaces spoke to her in ways words couldn't. The rest of her family didn't understand it, but they never discouraged it either. At least, not openly. Sophie's bond with the wild mustangs of the valley had started years ago when her father had still been around. He'd taught her to ride, to care for the horses, to work the land, but it had been the wild ones that had called to her. It was in the way they moved with such power and grace, and the way they seemed to understand the world in ways people never could. On that particular morning, the sun had barely begun to climb over the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. Sophie was already out by the paddocks, her boots kicking up dust as she made her way toward the hills where the wild horses roamed. Her breath was steady, the cool morning air filling her lungs as she climbed higher. She loved the silence up here, the feeling of being so close to nature, so close to the heart of the world. But today was different. Sophie felt it in her bones. There was something in the air, something off, but she couldn't quite place it. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath. Her dog, Scout, a scrappy little terrier, trotted alongside her, his ears alert to the world around him. He had the energy of a tornado and the courage of a lion, but even he seemed uneasy today. As they rounded a rocky outcrop, Sophie spotted something ahead. Her heart stopped for a beat. There, tangled in a poacher's bear trap, was a wild Mustang. The mare was trapped, her leg caught at an awkward angle. She was a beautiful animal, dark, almost black, with a white star on her forehead that stood out like a beacon. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she took in the scene. The mare's eyes were wide with fear, and her body trembled in pain. Scout whimpered and pulled at the leash, but Sophie was already moving toward the mare. Her steps were steady, but inside her heart was racing. She knew the danger. Wild horses weren't like the ones they had on the ranch. They were unpredictable, untamed, and often aggressive. But Sophie wasn't afraid. She never was when it came to animals. She crouched down a few feet from the mare, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. The Mustang's head snapped toward her, ears pinned back, nostrils flaring. Sophie's heart skipped. The mare was terrified, but there was something else in her eyes, something Sophie recognized immediately: desperation. Sophie spoke softly, her voice a calming whisper. "It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you." The mare's eyes flickered toward her, and for a moment, Sophie thought she saw a flicker of understanding. She reached for the trap, her fingers trembling slightly as she examined it. It was old, rusty, but still functional. Too dangerous for a wild animal to escape on its own. She tugged at the metal, trying to free the mare, but it wouldn't budge. "Sophie, what the hell are you doing?" Sophie whipped her head around, startled. Her grandfather, Charles, was storming toward her, his face a mask of anger and worry. "I'm helping her," Sophie said, standing up, her voice steady but firm. "She's stuck, Grandpa." Charles shook his head, eyes narrowing. "You can't just go around trying to help every wild horse you find, Sophie. They're dangerous. You don't know what you're dealing with." "I know," Sophie replied, her voice quiet but unwavering. "I know her. I can help her." Before Charles could argue, a voice from behind them interrupted. "You're right, Sophie, she does know you." Sophie turned to find Luke Silver Fox, the local horse trainer, standing on the other side of the clearing. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a face weathered by years in the sun. He had the kind of presence that made people listen, even when he wasn't trying to command attention. "Luke, Sophie started, but he raised a hand to stop her. "Let's get her out of this trap first," Luke said, walking over to the mare. "I'll help you, but we need to do it carefully." Sophie watched as Luke knelt beside the mare, his hands moving with practiced precision. His eyes met hers for a brief moment. "She's a wild one, Sophie. You've got to be careful with her. Wild horses don't trust easily." "I know," Sophie said, stepping back to give Luke room to work. "But she trusts me." After a tense moment, Luke finally managed to pry the trap open enough to free the mare's leg. She let out a soft whinny, her leg trembling as she stood. Sophie held her breath, watching as the mare tested her injured leg, taking tentative steps forward. Luke stepped back, looking at Sophie. "She's lucky you found her," he said, his voice soft with respect. "But you can't keep her. She's wild, Sophie. She belongs out there." Sophie's heart sank. She knew what Luke meant, but there was a connection between her and the mare, a bond that went beyond words. "I know," she whispered, "but I can't just leave her like this." Charles's voice cut through the silence. "Sophie, you're not keeping that wild thing. It's too dangerous." Sophie turned to face him, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I'm not asking for permission, Grandpa. I'm asking for your help." Charles' eyes softened just a little. He was tough, but even he couldn't ignore the desperation in his granddaughter's voice. After a long moment, he nodded, though the skepticism remained in his eyes. "Fine, but I'm not doing this alone." Sophie smiled. "Thank you." Before anyone could speak again, a low growl came from the distance. It was the sound of a truck, the engine roaring as it neared. Sophie's stomach tightened. She recognized that engine sound. Wesley Tanner. Tanner, the local land developer, had been sniffing around the area for weeks, talking about cleaning up the land and bringing in new businesses. Sophie knew better than to trust him. And now, she realized, Tanner had found out about Mystic. The truck engine rumbled louder as it came closer, its headlights slicing through the early morning mist. Sophie stood frozen, her hand still resting on Mystic's neck, feeling the horse's powerful breath. The mare's every muscle still tensed in the aftermath of the trap. The realization hit Sophie with a sudden weight. Wesley Tanner, the land developer she'd heard whispers about, was coming for the wild horses. She turned to Luke, who was already looking toward the sound of the truck, his face hardening into a frown. "We have to move her," Luke said quietly, his voice carrying a note of urgency. Sophie nodded. She didn't have to ask what he meant. Tanner wouldn't be content just knowing where Mystic was. He would take action, and she couldn't let that happen. Not to Mystic, not to her. "Come on," Luke said, and Sophie quickly led Mystic away from the clearing, urging her to move despite the mare's limp. The air was still cool, but Sophie could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The wild mare, once so untouchable, was now her responsibility. She had to protect her. As they moved further into the woods, Sophie heard the rumble of Tanner's truck growing louder. "He's coming," she said softly, her voice tight. Luke nodded but didn't speak. His eyes were sharp, scanning the trees. It wasn't just Tanner's truck they needed to worry about. It was the men he had working for him. Men who would do whatever it took to capture the Mustangs. Sophie couldn't help but glance over at Mystic. The mare's eyes, so full of fear and confusion when they first met, had softened, as though she knew Sophie was trying to help her. Sophie had seen something in those eyes, something that made her believe Mystic trusted her in a way few animals trusted people. She couldn't let that trust be broken. "You need to get to Dr. Rivera," Luke said, breaking Sophie's thoughts. "She's the only one who can help Mystic with that leg." Sophie nodded. Dr. Elena Rivera, a wildlife conservationist, had been Sophie's secret ally for months. She knew about the wild mustangs in the valley and the threats they faced, especially from people like Tanner. Dr. Rivera had been working on a plan to move the mustangs to safety, but Sophie knew that plan needed to happen now, before Tanner caught wind of it. "You think we can get her out of here without him finding us?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Luke's face darkened. "I don't know, but we don't have a choice. We're running out of time." The sound of the truck grew closer, and Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. She knew that if they were caught now, Mystic wouldn't stand a chance. Sophie had seen the way Tanner treated the land and animals. His greed for expansion had no limits, and the mustangs were just a nuisance to him. The woods seemed to close in around them as they moved deeper into the valley. The path was narrow, with trees pressing in on both sides, but Sophie knew this land like the back of her hand. She'd walked these trails 100 times, with nothing but the sound of her boots crunching on the ground and the wind through the branches to keep her company. But now it was different. The trees felt like they were watching them. Sophie's breath was shallow, her nerves on edge. She kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see the flash of headlights behind them at any moment. Just as they rounded a bend in the path, they saw the familiar silhouette of Dr. Rivera's truck parked at the clearing ahead. Sophie's heart leaped with relief. Dr. Rivera was leaning against the side of the truck, her eyes scanning the trees for any sign of them. When she spotted Sophie and Luke, she straightened up, her expression serious. "You made it," she said, her voice laced with both relief and concern. "Is she okay?" Sophie nodded quickly, though her heart was still racing. "She's hurt, the trap. We have to get her to safety. Tanner's coming." Dr. Rivera's brow furrowed. "We need to move fast. I've got a plan, but it's going to be risky. If Tanner catches wind of what we're doing, he won't hesitate to make a move." Sophie nodded. She knew the risks, but there was no time to hesitate. "What do we need to do?" "We need to get her into the back of the truck, but we can't just drive her out of here. We'll need a safe route, a way to keep her hidden from Tanner's men. They'll be looking for us." Luke's eyes flickered with thought. "We'll use the back road. It's risky, but it's the only way to get her out of here undetected." Sophie's hands clenched into fists. "Let's do it." The plan was simple, but that didn't make it easy. Luke, Sophie, and Dr. Rivera quickly moved Mystic toward the truck, coaxing her into the back with gentle words and soft gestures. Mystic hesitated, her body stiff with nerves, but Sophie remained calm, feeling the connection between them deep in her bones. Mystic trusted her. As they loaded Mystic into the truck, Sophie took one last look around, her heart heavy with the weight of what was happening. Tanner's men were getting closer. She could feel it. "Sophie," Dr. Rivera said, breaking her thoughts, "we're almost ready, but we need to get you out of here before Tanner's men show up." Sophie hesitated, but Luke's voice cut through her hesitation. "Sophie, we can't wait. We have to go now." The truck's engine roared to life, and Sophie scrambled into the passenger seat beside Dr. Rivera. The truck lurched forward, kicking up dust as they made their way toward the back road. Sophie looked back at the forest, the place where she'd first found Mystic. It felt like she was leaving a part of herself behind, but there was no time to linger. They had to keep moving. As they turned onto the narrow back road, Sophie's thoughts raced. She had no idea how long they had before Tanner found them, or what he would do when he did. "We're not out of the woods yet," Luke said from the back of the truck, his voice grim. Tanner won't stop, and he has a lot of people looking for these horses. Sophie swallowed, her heart sinking. She knew Luke was right. Tanner would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. But Sophie was determined to stop him. For Mystic. For all the wild mustangs that deserved to be free. The road ahead was treacherous, winding through narrow passes and steep hills. The truck bounced over rocks and dips, but they pressed on. Sophie felt every bump in her chest, but she didn't dare take her eyes off the road ahead. Finally, after what felt like hours, the truck came to a stop. Dr. Rivera turned to Sophie, her face tired but resolute. "We're here," she said. "The sanctuary is just ahead." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She looked out the window to see the sprawling expanse of land ahead. Open fields, tall grasses, and the distant promise of safety for Mystic and the rest of the herd. But before they could move any further, the sound of an engine filled the air. Tanner had found them. The air was thick with tension as Dr. Rivera's truck rumbled along the narrow back road, the engine's growl breaking the stillness of the valley. Sophie glanced nervously over her shoulder, the dark silhouette of the forest now behind them. Mystic, nestled in the truck bed, shifted slightly, her breath deep and steady, though Sophie could see the remnants of fear in the mare's eyes. "Keep an eye out for any signs of Tanner's men," Luke called from the back, his voice carrying through the cab of the truck. He was watching the rearview mirror, scanning for movement in the trees. Sophie's heart was hammering in her chest, a constant reminder of how close they were to disaster. The truck had barely made it a few miles down the rough dirt track before Sophie had begun to hear the distant sound of engines. Too close. Too familiar. Tanner's men were closing in, and the pressure was mounting. Sophie felt the overwhelming weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She hadn't just promised to help Mystic. She had promised to protect her, no matter the cost. She knew what Tanner was capable of, and the thought of Mystic and the herd falling into his hands made her stomach turn. "This is it, Doctor," Rivera murmured, pulling the truck to a halt at the edge of a dense copse of trees. The thick brush and undergrowth provided a cover of sorts, a temporary sanctuary, but only if they could keep moving fast. The engine cut off with a soft thud, and the sound of the wind in the trees seemed to press in on them. Sophie didn't waste a second. She opened the door and hopped out, her boots landing softly in the dirt as she moved to the back of the truck. Mystic was still, but her large, dark eyes flicked toward Sophie, as though asking her what would happen next. "Let's get you out of here," Sophie whispered, reaching for the mare's reins. Mystic's ears flicked forward, her nostrils flaring slightly, as though she knew the danger was closer than ever. But as Sophie led Mystic down from the truck, she could feel the bond between them grow stronger. Something unspoken but undeniable passed between them, like a promise, a silent vow to get through this. "I'll take the lead," Luke called from the truck, his voice low but firm. "Stay close, both of you. We need to move quickly." His eyes darted between Dr. Rivera and Sophie. "If Tanner's men get here before we do, this whole thing is over." Dr. Rivera nodded, her expression focused. "We've got a good 5 miles to cover before we hit the sanctuary. If we can stay off the main roads, we'll be okay." But Sophie could see the doubt in her eyes, the uncertainty that only someone who had been part of too many close calls could understand. Sophie swallowed hard, tightening her grip on Mystic's reins. "We'll make it. We have to." Dr. Rivera gave her a fleeting smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. The atmosphere had shifted. The weight of the situation was no longer just about getting Mystic to safety. It was about the whole herd, and the possibility of losing it all if they weren't fast enough. The trees around them were dense, with branches creaking and leaves rustling in the wind. The path ahead was treacherous, narrow, winding, and barely passable for the truck, let alone a herd of wild mustangs. The forest seemed to close in around them as they moved, the only sounds their steady footsteps and Mystic's soft snorting. As they made their way deeper into the forest, Sophie tried not to think about the inevitable confrontation ahead. She had seen the dark glint in Tanner's eyes, heard the threats in his voice. He wouldn't give up so easily. He'd spent years making deals, manipulating people to get what he wanted, and he had no intention of letting a handful of wild horses stand in his way. "How much further?" Sophie asked, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. She had to stay calm for Mystic, for herself, for everyone. "We're getting close," Luke replied, his voice reassuring. But Sophie noticed the tension in his jaw. "We've got to cross the creek up ahead. That'll be the hardest part." Sophie nodded. She knew the creek. It was deep in some spots, with sharp rocks that could easily break a horse's legs if they weren't careful. And the horses, wild and unpredictable, would be spooked. She looked over at Mystic, who had her head low, eyes scanning the undergrowth. Dr. Rivera walked alongside them, her boots crunching against the dirt. "Once we're across the creek, we're on safer ground," she said. "The sanctuary will be just a few miles further." But Sophie's mind wasn't focused on the sanctuary. It was on Tanner and the men he had following them. She couldn't shake the image of them, gruff faces, calloused hands, and eyes full of greed. They were closing in, and they weren't the type to give up easily. Suddenly, a loud crash broke through the air. Sophie froze, her heart leaping in her chest. It was distant, but unmistakable. Someone had stepped on a branch. Her eyes darted to Luke, who immediately gestured for silence. They all crouched low, blending into the shadows as the sounds of footsteps and engines approached. Sophie's pulse quickened. It was Tanner. She could feel it. They weren't alone anymore. "We've got to move now," Luke whispered urgently. "They've found us." The adrenaline surged through Sophie's veins. Mystic, sensing the change, snorted and stamped her hooves, but Sophie quickly soothed her. "Easy, girl," she whispered, her voice steady. "We've got to go, just a little further." The others nodded, and, without another word, they moved as quickly as possible, pushing through the dense brush, the sound of rustling leaves and snapping twigs filling the air. Sophie's eyes were locked on the trail ahead, but her ears were tuned to every little noise behind them. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the leaves sent a spike of fear through her heart. They reached the creek after what seemed like an eternity. Sophie took one look at the rushing water, then turned back to Mystic, who seemed to hesitate at the edge, as if sensing the danger. The water was fast-moving and icy, the current strong enough to make the crossing treacherous. "Hold on, Mystic," Sophie whispered. "We can do this." Without waiting for any more hesitation, she nudged the mare forward. Mystic stepped into the water, her hooves making splashes in the chill. Sophie felt a sharp shiver run through her as the cold water soaked through her boots, but she kept going, urging the mare to keep moving. Behind them, Luke and Doctor. Rivera followed, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the roar of the creek. The current tugged at Sophie's legs, but she gritted her teeth and pressed forward. Mystic's powerful legs were steady, though the water was pushing against her. The crossing was slow, and Sophie felt the seconds stretching into minutes. They couldn't afford to waste time. When they reached the opposite shore, Sophie took a deep breath, her chest heaving. She quickly turned around to see Doctor, Rivera and Luke making their way across, but there was no time to rest. "We've got to move faster," Luke said, his voice tight with urgency. Sophie nodded, not needing to hear more. She could feel it now. Tanner's men were closing in. They were almost there, but not quite. She pushed forward, urging Mystic to follow, feeling the mare's stride steady and sure beneath her. The sanctuary was so close, but every step felt like it could be their last. The courtroom was cold, the air heavy with tension as Sophie sat between her mother and Luke. The wood-paneled walls echoed with the faint murmur of voices and the shuffle of papers, but Sophie barely heard it. Her mind was elsewhere, on the Mustangs, on Mystic, and on the battle they were about to face. This wasn't a typical court case. It wasn't about property lines or contracts. It was about life and freedom. And for Sophie, it was about the future of a herd of wild Mustangs that she had come to know and love. Mystic's fate hung in the balance, as did the fate of her bond with the mare that had saved her time and time again. Sophie's fingers tightened around the edge of the bench. It was a strange feeling, sitting in the same room as Wesley Tanner, the man whose greed had driven all of this. His cold eyes flicked toward her from time to time, but he never met her gaze directly. There was a certain fear in him now, a subtle hint of unease, as he realized the tides were turning against him. The trial had begun several days earlier, but today was the crucial moment, the hearing where Tanner's fate would be decided. His legal team had spent days trying to poke holes in the BLM's case, but Sophie knew that the truth was on their side. The Mustangs, including Mystic, were federally protected, but Tanner's influence, his money, and his long reach in the community had meant the battle was far from over. Sophie glanced at her mother, Rachel, who sat stiffly beside her. Rachel's face was drawn, her expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. Sophie could feel the weight of her mother's support, but she could also sense her fear. They had already been through so much, and now they were on the verge of losing it all. "Sophie," Luke whispered, leaning closer to her, "this is it. You've got this. Just keep your head in the game." Sophie nodded, though her heart was pounding in her chest. It was hard to concentrate with so much at stake. The judge, a middle-aged man with a stern expression and thick glasses, called the courtroom to order. His gavel slammed down with a sharp echo that sent a chill down Sophie's spine. "This court will now hear closing arguments," the judge announced. "Mr. Tanner, you may proceed." Wesley Tanner stood up, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the rugged rancher's clothing of the surrounding men. He adjusted his tie, his eyes scanning the courtroom with cold precision. "We're not here to debate the worth of wild Mustangs," Tanner began, his voice smooth and practiced. "We're here to discuss property rights, and the law is clear. Those horses were found on my land. I have the right to manage the herd as I see fit. This entire case is nothing but an overreach of federal authority." Sophie clenched her fists. She had heard this argument before, his rehearsed speech about ownership, about control, about the Mustangs being a nuisance to his business plans. "You see," Tanner continued, his gaze now shifting to Sophie, "this is not a case about saving wild horses. This is a case about a little girl who thinks she can play God with animals." Sophie's breath caught in her throat, but she refused to back down. He was trying to undermine her, trying to make her seem foolish for caring so much. But she wouldn't let him. She wouldn't let anyone make her feel small when it came to Mystic and the herd. Tanner's lawyer stood up, nodding in agreement. "That's right, Your Honor. The Reynolds family may have a soft spot for these animals, but that doesn't change the fact that they were removed from property that has been in the Tanner family for generations." Sophie felt her blood boil, but she kept her face calm. This wasn't about her, it was about the Mustangs. Dr. Elena Rivera, who had been called as a key witness for the defense, now took the stand. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady but tinged with the exhaustion of the trial. "The Clearwater Mustangs are not simply wild horses. They are part of a larger ecosystem. Their presence on that land is essential to the balance of nature. To remove them would disrupt the very fabric of this environment. Your Honor, Tanner interrupted, this is exactly what I mean. This is not about science or the environment, it's about government overreach. The judge raised a hand, silencing Tanner. He turned to Dr. Rivera. Dr. Rivera, please continue. Dr. Rivera nodded, adjusting her glasses. The Clearwater Mustangs have been federally protected since 1971. They are considered a part of our national heritage. Their presence on public land ensures the preservation of historical bloodlines and contributes to the natural biodiversity of the region. Sophie could feel the shift in the room as Dr. Rivera's testimony hit home. The tide was turning. Tanner's arguments about property rights, about ownership, were starting to ring hollow in the face of scientific evidence. But Sophie knew this wouldn't be the end of it. She had seen how far Tanner was willing to go to get what he wanted. He wouldn't give up without a fight. As the courtroom settled, Sophie was called to the stand. She stood, her heart thudding in her chest, as she made her way to the front. She tried not to think about the eyes that were on her. Tanner's cold, calculating stare, the curious glances from the jury, the sympathetic looks from her family. She focused instead on the reason she was there: Mystic, Thunder, and the entire herd. "Tell us, Miss Reynolds," the judge asked, his voice gentle. "Why do you feel so strongly about the Mustangs?" Sophie took a deep breath. She had prepared for this. She had practiced, but now, with the weight of the world on her shoulders, the words came from her heart, raw and real. "Because they're not just horses," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside her. "They're a part of something bigger than all of us. Mystic. Mystic saved me, and I have to protect her. I have to protect them. They're not property to be owned. They're creatures of the land, and they deserve to be free." Her words hung in the air, and for a long moment there was silence in the courtroom. Sophie could see the jury members exchange glances, some of them nodding as though they understood. Tanner, however, was unfazed. He leaned forward, his expression hardening. "And what about the ranch, Miss Reynolds? What about your family's livelihood? What will happen when you drive out the people who've been running this land for generations? What happens when you lose everything because of this crusade?" Sophie met his gaze, her heart steady. "We'll find a way, we always do. But the Mustangs, they can't fight for themselves. I'm fighting for them, because no one else will." Sophie's voice was unwavering, and for the first time since the trial had started, she felt a surge of hope. This wasn't just about her, this was about something bigger. The Mustangs were more than animals. They were a symbol, a reminder of everything that was worth fighting for. As the judge nodded, signaling that Sophie could step down, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The trial had reached its peak, and Sophie knew it was only a matter of time before the verdict would be handed down. But she also knew something else. She had said her piece, and in her heart, she had given Mystic and the herd everything she had. The courtroom was alive with the hum of anticipation, the kind of silence that filled a space just before everything changed. Sophie sat at the edge of her seat, eyes fixed on the judge as he picked up his gavel. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. Mystic's future, the future of the wild Mustangs, and even Sophie's own future were all hanging on the words that were about to be spoken. For what seemed like an eternity, the judge surveyed the courtroom, his eyes narrowing behind his glasses as he weighed the arguments presented before him. Sophie's heart thudded in her chest, each beat echoing the hope and fear she felt all at once. Wesley Tanner sat across the room, his face set in a grimace of quiet fury. His lawyers had fought hard, using every tactic they could muster, but Sophie knew they were losing. His grip on the land was slipping, and he could see that now. The judge slammed the gavel down, signaling the conclusion of the trial. The room grew still, the air crackling with the energy of the moment. After careful consideration, the judge began, his voice carrying authority. I have decided that the Clearwater Mustang herd shall remain protected under federal law. The injunction filed by Mr. Tanner is hereby dismissed, and all claims to the herd are void. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as a wave of relief washed over her. Her body felt as if it had been holding its breath for days, and now, finally, she could exhale. The battle had been won. The Mustangs were safe. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, but Sophie only had eyes for Mystic. She had been fighting for this moment, fighting for Mystic and the herd, but now, as the reality set in, it felt surreal. Luke stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You did it," he whispered. "You saved them." Sophie nodded, her face a mixture of disbelief and exhaustion. She glanced over at her mother, Rachel, whose face had softened with the first true smile Sophie had seen in days. There were still many challenges ahead, but for now, they had won. Sophie started, her voice breaking. I didn't want to lose her. I didn't want to lose them. She looked up at Luke, her eyes filled with gratitude. Luke gave her a reassuring smile. You didn't. You gave them a future. As they filed out of the courtroom, Sophie felt the weight of the moment sink in. The Mustangs were safe, but the fight wasn't over. Tanner was still a threat, and there would be obstacles ahead. But for now, Sophie allowed herself a moment of triumph. Later that evening, as the family gathered at the ranch, a quiet sense of peace settled over the place. The sun had dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the land. Mystic and the herd were in a nearby pasture, grazing peacefully. Thunder, Mystic's young colt, pranced around, his energy contagious. Sophie stood at the fence, her fingers brushing the rough wood as she watched them. They were safe now. The wild horses, once vulnerable and in danger, had found a home where they could thrive, a home where they could live without fear. "Hey, Mom," Sophie said softly, turning to her mother. "Do you think they know we won?" Rachel smiled, her eyes softening. "I think they do. Mystic always knew what was coming, didn't she?" Sophie nodded, her eyes fixed on the mare. "She's incredible." "I think you're both incredible," Rachel replied, her voice filled with emotion. "You've taught us all something." Sophie felt a lump form in her throat as she turned back to the herd. Mystic, the midnight stallion now known as Shadow, and the other Mustangs were free to roam. They were safe, and Sophie had made it happen. It wasn't just her success, it was their success. They had all been part of this journey. As the days passed, life at the Reynolds Ranch began to settle into a new rhythm. The sanctuary, now a recognized satellite of the Johnson County Wildlife Sanctuary, began to take shape. The Mustangs had their space, wide, open fields to roam, and protective barriers that kept them safe from human interference. Sophie spent her days working with Luke and the rest of the team, learning everything she could about wild horse conservation. She and Mystic continued their quiet bond, and every evening Sophie would visit the herd, sitting by Mystic's side as the mare nickered softly, sensing her presence. "Do you think they'll ever fully trust us?" Sophie asked one evening as she leaned against the fence, her eyes following the Mustangs as they grazed in the distance. Luke was quiet for a moment, watching the herd. "They already do," he said finally. "It's just a matter of giving them space to show it in their own way." Sophie smiled. There was so much to learn, but she was patient. Mystic had taught her the value of trust and time. She would continue to fight for the Mustangs, for their protection and preservation, but now she felt a peace she hadn't known before. As the first winter snow began to fall, the Reynolds Ranch was bustling with activity. The sanctuary had drawn attention from across the country, and visitors began arriving to learn about the Mustangs and their story. Sophie was becoming a spokesperson for the cause, speaking at events and working with conservation groups to ensure the Mustangs' protection. One evening, as Sophie sat in the warmth of the family kitchen, looking out at the snowy landscape, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had saved Mystic, but Mystic had saved her too. The connection they shared was more than just a bond between human and animal. It was a testament to the power of compassion, perseverance, and trust. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but inside the house, Sophie felt warmth in her chest. The battle had been long, and there were still challenges ahead, but the fight had been worth it. She had done it. She had changed the world for the Mustangs, and in turn had changed herself. "Mom, Luke," Sophie said quietly, "this isn't the end, is it?" Rachel smiled, walking over to her daughter and placing a hand on her shoulder. "No, sweetheart, it's just the beginning." Sophie looked out at the snow-covered land, her heart full. Mystic, Thunder, and the others were free, and that was all that mattered. The Reynolds Ranch had become more than just a home. It had become a sanctuary, a place where wild things were protected, and a place where love and trust between animals and humans could thrive. This was their new beginning, and Sophie knew, deep in her heart, that this was only the start of something even bigger. The Mustang's story was far from over, and neither was hers.